Hello friends, welcome. I hope that this message finds you well. So today I'm excited to share with you a new series of videos that I'm making called A Play of Words. And this comes from my long-standing passion about looking at the meaning of words, their history, and what their true origins are. And the reason for this is often we use words that we have inherited, we learned as children, and those that we absorb from our culture and the country we live in. So more often than not, we don't really know the real meaning of the words we even use. So wouldn't it actually be nice to know the intention and the real meaning of a word that we use? I hope that you would agree. So there are many ways to look at the true origins and meanings of word. And in this particular series, I will be exploring with my guests who study languages or speak multiple languages or study music, philosophy, etc., to come together and look at the deeper roots of language. One way to look at the history or origin of a word is to look at their etymology, at their history, and we might find that a word is actually connected to the ancient Greek language or to Latin or the ancient language of India called Sanskrit, or Arabic for that matter. And not just that, but that these different historical pathways intermingle with each other and are connected. So as we look at them, we become aware of the true reasons and intents behind the creation of a word, and how over time new intentions emerged, new cultural movements, propaganda, and other things affect the meaning that we collectively associate with a word. So this alone is fascinating, but at the same time there are other dimensions of language. For instance, the dimension of language mysticism or sound mysticism. What that means is that if you didn't know the language that I was speaking right now, words would just be sounds to your ears. But if you knew the language that I was speaking, then each word would create an image in your mind, would trigger different thoughts and different images, and will thus create a magical reality for you. And it is no surprise that words like grammar and spelling are actually connected to words like spell, which means to morph, to change your perception. So in fact, when we speak language, we are casting spells in a way. And when we hear languages, spells are being cast. So wouldn't it be nice that we became conscious of what was the reality that we were creating through the sounds that we're producing and through the sounds that we're hearing? Wouldn't this be very useful if you were hearing propaganda or lies that want to trigger anxiety or fear in you? So these are just some of the pathways, and I'm sure that there are many more. And I would love to hear from you. What are your comments and your thoughts on other pathways that we could explore in this series? These episodes are going to be a little shorter, perhaps half an hour. I look forward to being on this journey with you, and I hope that you will join me. Thank you.
All right.
Here we are.
Here we are.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Potential Paradigms. So today, this is a shorter episode, and we have with us Chaise. Chaise is our first in-person guest here. So thank you, Chaise, for being here. And thank you actually for helping me with the setup.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me, Kanan. Happy to be on the Potential Paradigms podcast today.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. Good to have you. And so yeah, this is our new studio. As you can see, we improvised a number of things here. So yeah, maybe let's connect. This is sort of a mini episode, and we wanted to talk about etymology or words, something that both of us are really passionate about and have enjoyed talking about it in a couple of conversations before we decided to record. So why don't you take a go as to what fascinates you about words and their meanings?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for the question. That's a good one. What fascinates me, I think about words, that the first thing that comes to mind is something that the scholar David Abram wrote in his book, The Spell of the Sensuous. And he refers to language as an organ of perception, that the words and the syntax and the grammar that we use build in some way the ways that we perceive the all things, ourselves and the earth and the other than that. And I think for me, that was those ideas like that, or ideas from the linguist Ludwig Wittgenstein around how language makes the way we engage with the world, really opened me to this kind of pursuit of like, what are words? What is language? And what is carried, this metaphor of like, what's the dirt underneath the fingernails of the words that I'm using? Where did they come from? And what have they meant before now? Are the things that kind of fascinate me and keep me coming back to etymology and word history.
Yeah, wonderful. One of the words that you use, grammar, it triggered in me that it's also connected with spells.
Mm-hmm.
And in the history, the etymology of the word grammar, and it connects with the connection of the impact of sound
Mm-hmm.
On us. And one of the things that has inspired me to investigate language is that, in its essence, language is just sound.
Mm.
And by hearing sound, we have as humans the capacity to create meaning.
Mm.
But that's not with all sounds necessarily. With certain sounds, like the language, our mother tongue, we're trained to form certain associations.
Mm-hmm.
But I've found it to be more playful, that as we begin to explore these paths, those meanings and associations and our interaction with sound that we use to communicate with life in general starts to morph and inform us of many dimensions and realms that are existing in the here and now.
Mm-hmm.
So anyways, I think that's maybe we can start there. Do you have any
Yeah,
thoughts?
I was thinking about, grammar, like this word and it like origin, the connection to spellcraft and its connection to the altering of perception, because in some ways that's what a spell is. And even with that, talking about spells, we have this diverts us back to, we spell our words. And if we can look at that as a magical act or as something we learned to do in grammar school, that doesn't really have that much meaning, but to spell our words, to use correct grammar is to, in one way, to be, like you're saying, like maybe to be practicing meaning making in a very particular way. That's a little bit more playful than just the sort of, if I say the dog sits, that it creates meaning in your mind of this animal that we call a dog sits down, that there might be something else behind those practices of spelling and grammar. And the connection between grammar as a word and this old English and old Scottish word, glamour, and grammary. And that like glamour has the connotation of altering someone's perception so that they don't see what's real or what's there, but they see what you want them to see. It often gets portrayed that way in media, like in the media about witches and things like that. Like they glamour people, or vampires glamour people.
Yes.
But those kinds of routes feel like they bring in the weight and the ethic of being a user of language. Yeah, not casting spells unintentionally over people's perception by the ways we use our words.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. I love especially the theme that you invoked here, which is responsibility. And with responsibility, for myself, I have learned to break the word into two words: response and ability. The ability to respond.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes the word responsibility has a different connotation with like a weight and obligation.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I like what you said about being a responsible user of the language and seeing how we're molding our own perception and the perception of those to whom we're offering sound or language. Because oftentimes it seems like when we're unaware, it is just regurgitation, so to speak, of what we have absorbed from our environment, culture, and society. And exploring the different meanings, as you were beautifully explaining, grammar and its connection with glamour, that we become aware of perhaps the necessity of where these words
Mhm.
are coming from. Another interesting theme again was sound. As if I were to speak a language that someone doesn't know, it would have a radically different effect on them
Mhm.
than if they somehow knew those combinations and perceived them as a language. So I
Mhm.
could say to them something which might be demeaning, you're stupid, for example, and might invoke a certain kind of emotional response. And if they didn't know the language, it definitely might not have that response, or it could appear to be musical
Mhm.
or uplifting.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I totally feel that in a way, it's an empowering practice to explore. And I think you use the word playful, to
Mhm.
become a playful artist of how we use language
Mhm.
in a responsible way.
Mm. Yeah, what you just said, riffing on this idea of speaking in a language that someone maybe doesn't know, and how that would impact someone differently. It reminded me of something that I read. The Irish poet Patrick O'Tuma. He's in the north of Ireland at a community called called Corrymeela, and they're doing a lot of work, restorative justice work. I don't know if that's necessarily the word they would use, but that's popping.
Hmm.
And he talks about in this sense that like words and sound are not disconnected from. They're not only ethereal; they have body because our bodies make them. And so that when you touch someone with your language, that your body's also engaging with that person. And it just makes me think about even when we're making sounds that are unintelligible to someone, our bodies, the tensions and the shapes and the emotions that we're in our bodies are also engaging with that person's body. And so they are being impacted, even if the like syllabically it doesn't make sense. And I'm curious about that. It seems similar to the way that um, bird calls make my body do certain things. If there's a bird alarming at some perceived threat, my body responds to that, even though I don't necessarily grammatically speak the language of the Buick's wren or another bird, or trees moving and the different sound susurrations that they make change all of the landscape of my internal world, even if I don't um, speak them in the same way I speak English. Are kind of where my mind goes. These other things that are, yeah, these other versions of language.
Yes,
Mm.
yes, beautiful. Yeah, one of as you were speaking, what came to me was something I'm always fascinated with is the native traditions, indigenous traditions, and their connection with natural sounds.
Mm.
Although perhaps you could say that all sounds are natural, but the swirling of the trees and the bird calls, even in their music, it is represented. And the languages that they have somehow, not that I'm a scholar, but it seems to have a correlation with the kind of cultures that they bring forth.
Mm.
Like in the native cultures, from my understanding, they don't have the concept of possession of language or ownership in the way that we have in the modern culture. And uh, they seem to be, even in their music and in their communication with nature and birds and animals, it's a less egoic communication of separating man from the world, but being somehow in harmony.
Mm.
And not just the idea of harmony, but in that communication uh, of a different kind of language.
Mm.
And listening to music, as you were saying, that the engagement of the body in language, music seems to make that very clear to us when it uplifts us, or certain kind of sensations are evoked in the body that are very tightly coupled with the emotional landscape of what we experience.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, feeling that, thinking about the indigenous people, particularly of Turtle Island, this place that I grew up and descended of settlers of, there's, this sense of how could your language not be of a place? If since time immemorial, you've been there, right? And so the sounds and the shapes and the movements of language of a people who are in their homelands is a particular thing, and it's so much of my work currently in my has been around, like, what does it mean to be a speaker of English in living in a colonial reality and in a colonial relationship with this place that I live, and how does when I go out and speak spells or speak stories or speak with my body to a place by putting my body on it, the tension that's created, that, like, because of the history of the stealing of land and my ancestors coming here, um, I'm having to like decode and pull back the English and figure out where is English really just like kind of this mercantile colonial language that it feels like it is, that has kind of spread over the earth, that doesn't really have a place. Is there earth in it? Is the question that comes to me. Do the animals actually exist in English, or is it kind of just this like morass over a place? And finding ways to rewild it. And I think, this conversation around etymology and words and what they could mean when you allow them to take flight and make their own meaning feels like a part of the journey towards speaking in a way that's in harmony with the place that we find ourselves. I don't know if you follow that, but that's kind of what I feel in response to your question.
Yeah. No, that's really beautiful, and beautiful contemplation, I must say. That how deeply language and sound and our interaction with the environment coming as a feedback, again, coming through our vocal cords into the world. And how our perception, as you're saying, the key is that the perception can totally be transformed to something that would be like casting a spell, but it seems so normal that we don't even think about it, as you're saying, colonialism or capitalism, materialism, communism, all these isms. What if they were all part of this context of language as we are defining it as much wider set of interactions? Another thing that comes to mind is that we now live in an era where, as you and I were sharing our love of certain words and exploring these pathways, that we now have the ability to not just look at the history of a word in the English context, but you could connect it perhaps with the Greek mythology and the Sanskrit or the Indian mythology, the Native American sound. So perhaps also an opportunity to create something new, or to, I don't know, mix all these pathways and have a much wider palette, so to speak.
Yeah. And that my mother-in-law, Anne Simmons Booker, gave me this word blessken one time, which is that she was always saying in her teaching, like, things are blessed and things are broken, and both things are true. And she's like, what if I just had one word, blessken, right? And I think what you're pointing at for me feels like one of the blessken things of English is that it has been used in such a way that it's gone over the globe, and it picked up these language seeds from all of the places that it's been taken and used as a tool to indoctrinate people into a global culture. But one of the blessken things is that then we do have, when we start to dig into the etymology, suddenly these Greek gods start showing up, like you were sharing with me earlier, enthusiasm. And etymologically, like, to be possessed by a god. How powerful of a word. Entheos, coming from the Greek. And then words like this word world that we use etymologically comes from Old Norse, this word called wereld, which means man time, the time created by humans, right? And so we have suddenly every time we open our mouths, all of these culture streams, when we start to really look at, this is why I like the idea of the dirt, the ancestral soil and the fingernails of words. Like, we have this Mediterranean or Aegean Sea language coming out of our mouth, and then we have Sanskrit coming out of our mouth, and we have the indigenous languages, particularly like living here in California, some of the place names are all tumbling out of our mouth all of the time. And if we slow down, we can see the complexity of what's happening and really look at what we're invoking and what kind of energy sources we're hooking ourselves up to by picking the words that we're picking to describe
Yes.
what we perceive.
Yeah. 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 As you were saying, Entheos, when I was exploring this word, I mean, I always use the word enthusiasm, but it took me until last night to actually see what was already there, which is the beauty of exploring etymology, and Theos. It's right in front of the eyes, but I missed it. And in many of the indigenous traditions where these languages emerge from, the deity or God is usually a force of nature. So these powers, or what they considered God, more often than not, is an actual presence manifesting in the natural world. And to be possessed by that gives a completely different meaning than to be possessed by something perhaps that's too invisible, right? And I wonder what the experience is when it's an actual natural force that you're in contact with.
Yeah. And this sense that I've heard from many of my teachers, the one that's ringing is Dr. Martin Shaw, talking about how it's not that there's a god of the river or a goddess of the river. The river is a goddess when you're in that kind of animate relationship with place. And that, what is it, like you're saying, the Entheos, to be possessed by a river, by a thing that we can be in and like engage with our bodies, instead of to be solely in that invisible realm, something like, these, like the goddess of a river, who is a little more invisible, archetypal or something.
Yeah.
To like ground it into place, into something we can make pilgrimage to and go to and be with. It's the sacredness of its body, its materiality. It feels there's something really rejuvenating about that move for me, of like looking at the inspiritedness of actual material place.
Yeah. And I think earlier we were talking about the word faith before, and it's connected with this theme that you're sharing. It's coming to me that faith I often separate it from the word belief, because the belief is, again, something that might not be in my experience, or that it's something separate, which would be the case with the materialistic paradigm where we live in, where it's matter versus spirit. But to kind of bring it back is a leap of faith. And as we begin to experience the inanimate becoming animate, the spirit returning to matter, then I feel like we're rising up in our capacity of faith. So that definitely seems like like a trajectory in all spiritual traditions, where our faith of matter being imbued with spirit rather than this or that comes back. And and another thing that I was thinking of earlier when we were speaking of sound, particularly in the tradition in the Indian language of Sanskrit, which is an ancient language, probably true of Aramaic and Latin, where a lot of the sounds are not necessarily spoken language, which is interesting, but they communicate a different higher realm, where language is not necessarily the way we use it day to day, but in those cultures was considered much more value and used as part of practices, listening to it as music or even as you were saying, to a point of repeating a mantra or a sound till they say that your subtle body or your body is vibrating and emanating that tone. And, perhaps the seers or the saints would say that they could sense the vibration of an individual. They could hear it. So yeah, that's another thing that came to mind, that particularly in Sanskrit and perhaps of a lot of the older languages, a lot of the words are not necessarily meant to be spoken in day-to-day exchange, but communicate a higher order, bring it down here, perhaps as a symbol to also return.
Yeah, it reminds me. There's kind of similar in the old Nordic poetry. There is a series of poems called the Havamal, or it's really one poem. It's a series of verses, the words of Odin, or the words of the one-eyed god. And in there, at one point, he says, if you really want to be wise about the runes, be silent. And that's a paraphrase of the stanza, but this same idea that there's some sounds, there's some shapes that we make with our body to make sound come out that aren't for every day. And that and there's a responsibility to take it back, to know like where to make those sounds, and in what contexts those sounds are to be made, and what they do when we make them. And that, I don't know how much I think about that. I mean, I think about it a lot. I think as a teacher, a high school teacher, and also as a storyteller, like I'm using my language to make meaning a lot, but to like really be in that reality, like that there's some sounds that are for certain places, and that I wasn't ever really taught growing up in this sort of like orphan cultural status of whiteness. Wasn't really taught that in an intact way, and how much I wonder about the impact of not being taught that, the sacredness of some sound, and the responsibility, and therefore the power that comes from those things.
Yeah. It's perhaps as a bigger theme, but it's I think it's happened everywhere over the world, where it become like an automatism where we're not really aware of language or anything, and everything has been sort of provided and given, and we're just the the end users or consumers, not even users, become consumers. And but it seems like there's also an okayness in that, because it seems a natural trajectory to rediscover our power and become empowered and creative through this process. So yeah, maybe we come back to this in a part 2 and actually take a deeper dive into some of these words. But I think these are some of I think that our conversation shows the depth of this topic, of really that there is not so much mysticism, but it's here and now. We're doing it all the time.
Yeah, I would love to come back and dive into the words and, be in the play, right?
Yes.
To take our relationships with language for a walk out loud and see what happens, together.
Yes. I love that. And feel great to have met someone who enjoys this passion, and we hope to do this more often. And so thank you, Chaise, for being with me, and thank you for being with us.